In the oldest corners of history, there exists a tale that even scholars hesitate to speak too loudly. They say his name was once carved in stone, sung in the halls of his palace, and feared across the land. But today, that same name carries only shadows, as if the syllables themselves still reek of smoke, iron, and blood. He was a king unlike any other, a ruler not satisfied with gold, nor with conquest, nor even with the worship of his people. His hunger reached beyond the earth itself. What he sought was the one thing no mortal could hold: eternity. On nights drowned in mist, he was seen standing on the balcony of his fortress. A cold moon hung above him, throwing silver light over the pale lines of his face, making him look less like a man and more like a statue of marble come to life. Servants whispered that he muttered incantations to the heavens, while others claimed he prayed to things far darker: spirits, demons, forgotten gods. Some swore they saw his lips curl into a smile whenever he uttered the word immortality. That smile, they said, was not of hope but of possession, as though he already believed the secret belonged to him. The secret, according to the rumors, was monstrous. A wandering alchemist or perhaps a sorcerer dressed as one had revealed it. Within the folds of the human brain lay the spark of life, memory, and strength. To eat of it was to swallow a soul, to weave another's existence into one's own, and in doing so, to lengthen one's years. It was knowledge born of nightmares, but to the king it was salvation. From that moment, his path was carved in stone and shadow. The first signs came from the dungeons beneath the castle. Once filled with thieves and rebels, the cells grew crowded with prisoners who vanished one by one. At night, villagers living near the fortress swore they heard chains drag across the stones and screams echo like the howling of wolves. By dawn, the fires of the palace kitchens smoked strangely sweet, and the rumor spread that another mind, another soul, had been devoured in the king's quest for eternal youth. Fear thickened the air of the kingdom like incense in a cathedral. To his subjects, the castle no longer stood as a beacon of power but as a tomb that breathed. Torchlight painted its walls red and gold, but always the shadows stretched longer, swallowing the courtyards, the gates, the very fields around it. Children were told not to look too long at its spires, lest their reflections remain trapped there forever. So the whispers grew. Some said the king's eyes glowed like embers when he walked through the great hall. Others swore that a pale hand sometimes appeared behind the stone blocks of the fortress walls, pressing desperately from the inside before vanishing into the dark. No proof was ever brought forward, but the stories refused to die. And through them all, one truth echoed. This was no longer a king of men, but a man who had begun to trade his humanity for the promise of a crown that death itself could not touch. If the dungeons were the kingdom's darkest rumor, then the banquets were its most terrifying truth. For years, the king's feasts had been the envy of foreign courts: golden platters piled high with roasted boar, goblets overflowing with spiced wine, and musicians filling the halls with melodies that trembled in gilded arches. Yet, as the whispers spread, the air within those banquets grew thick with dread, for everyone knew there was always one dish that mattered most: the king's cup of brains. It was never placed openly on the table. Instead, it arrived in silence, carried by a trembling servant who bowed so low his forehead touched the floor. Upon a tray of black velvet sat a silver chalice, polished so brightly it reflected the torches above. What it contained was not spoken of, not named, not even glanced at too long. But those who dared to peek swore they saw a pale, trembling paste flesh and memory reduced to something both sacred and obscene. Before lifting it to his lips, the king performed what some called a ritual, others a mockery of prayer. He would raise the chalice with both hands, close his eyes, and whisper in a voice low enough to make the courtiers shiver. Some claimed he invoked the spirits of the dead whose brains he consumed, binding them to his own soul. Others believed he was bargaining with gods unknown, offering one life in exchange for another breath in his own body. Whatever the words were, they left the hall in silence, broken only by the crackle of fire and the distant howl of the wind. When he drank, the transformation was uncanny. His back straightened, his eyes sharpened, and his voice, so often hoarse with age, rang out like iron striking stone. He would laugh, a hollow sound that carried through the arches of the hall. "Their wisdom," he once declared, "is mine, their strength my own. No grave will claim me, no night will consume me." The courtiers clapped, but their applause was thin, like brittle glass about to shatter. It was not only prisoners who vanished. Records tell of scholars who entered the castle at the king's invitation and were never seen again. Artists, poets, healers, those whose minds were bright were most often chosen. To the king, their brilliance was not to be admired from afar, but devoured, absorbed, chained to his beating heart. Every brain he consumed became a trophy, not carved in marble or inscribed in parchment, but dissolved within his veins. And yet, beneath the splendor of the banquets, horror always lingered. Servants whispered of screams muffled by heavy stone doors. They spoke of heads carried away in baskets, of cooks forced to prepare meals with shaking hands, tears falling into their kettles. One story tells of a young scullery maid who opened the wrong door and saw a physician slicing open a skull on a marble slab. She never spoke again, her voice stolen not by magic but by terror too deep to name. Still, the people could not rebel. The king's shadow fell too long, too wide. He was not merely a ruler but a myth made flesh, a man who claimed to weave eternity into his blood. And in those halls of light and darkness, where chandeliers blazed above but the corners always remained black, the truth hardened. This was not a banquet of celebration. It was a sacrament of hunger, a ritual of horror that turned the king's court into a cathedral where death was both priest and offering. For a time, it seemed the king's madness had triumphed. His skin glowed with a vigor that mocked his true years. His voice thundered in council as though he had been born anew, and his gaze struck fear into enemies both within and beyond his borders. Those who doubted his grotesque practices began to whisper that perhaps, in some unspeakable way, he had truly harnessed eternity. But eternity is a jealous mistress, and the body of man was never built to contain stolen souls. The first signs of decay arrived in silence. He complained of headaches so sharp they split his skull like lightning across the night sky. His eyes, once piercing and unblinking, began to water and twitch, as though shadows only he could see danced at the edge of his sight. Some nights he clawed at his temples until blood streaked his fingers, crying out that there were voices, thousands of them screaming inside his head. Courtiers whispered that the very souls he had swallowed were now turning against him, rattling the cage of his mind. Soon the sickness spread beyond his mind. His skin, pale as alabaster, grew blotched and grey, mottled like marble left to rot in the rain. His hands trembled, shaking even when holding his golden scepter. Food, once his greatest indulgence, turned foul in his mouth, until only his silver chalice filled with its loathsome contents brought him a twisted comfort. Yet even that no longer restored him. His body stiffened, his movements faltered, and his laughter, once booming through the hall, cracked into a rasp that set even the bravest knights on edge. The physicians, cloaked in silks and bearing scrolls of ancient remedies, tried in vain to cure him. They brewed potions of herbs gathered under blood moons, they bathed him in waters infused with gold dust, they pressed charms of bone and amber against his fevered flesh. Nothing slowed the storm within him. Some scholars, writing long after his death, would describe his illness as the curse of his own appetite, something akin to the wasting plagues of the mind that modern science calls prion disease, a sickness born from consuming the very tissue that defines human thought. But to those living then, there was only one explanation. The king had been cursed by the gods, condemned for turning flesh and spirit into food. The fortress itself seemed to sicken with him. Where once fires roared warmly in the hearths, now the smoke stank of sourness, clinging to the tapestries like mildew. Candles guttered more quickly, their flames choking on invisible draughts. The walls dripped with dampness, as though the stone itself wept. Courtiers walked the halls with hushed steps, for fear the silence might be broken by the king's screams echoing from behind the doors of his chamber. Servants carried trays with trembling hands, flinching each time a moan, a cry, or the sound of shattered goblets tore through the night. His mind unraveled in fits of madness. At times he would order feasts for hundreds, only to appear clad in burial robes, muttering that his guests were corpses risen from the grave. At other times, he would barricade himself inside his chamber, scratching words into the walls in a script no one could read. The more he writhed in torment, the more his people believed the dead themselves were clawing their way back through him, seeking vengeance for the crimes carved into their bones. And yet, even as his sickness deepened, the rituals did not cease. If anything, they grew more desperate, more frantic. He demanded more prisoners, more scholars, more brilliant minds to fuel his failing body. The chalice was never empty, but each sip seemed to drain him further, as though the very cure he clung to had turned into poison. His body wasted away, his limbs thin as branches, his face hollowed until his crown seemed to float above a skull rather than rest on a living man. By then, fear had consumed the court. The lords avoided the palace, and the common folk crossed themselves whenever its spires cut the horizon. Mothers pulled their children away from the road that led to the fortress, whispering that to look upon its walls was to risk losing your reflection forever. And through it all the king lingered, half alive, half dead, a ghastly figure rattling in the dark corridors, clutching his silver chalice as if it were the only anchor tying him to this world. In those years the legend hardened. The king was no longer seen as merely cruel or mad. He became something else entirely, a vessel cracking under the weight of stolen lives, a monarch who had tried to bind eternity to his flesh and instead invited eternity's curse into his bones. And as the shadows thickened around his throne, there was only one certainty left. His death, when it came, would not be gentle, nor private, nor forgotten. It would be as grotesque as the life he had chosen. The end came not in silence, but in a storm of spectacle. For weeks the king's body had withered into a shadow of itself. Skin stretched thin across bone, eyes sunken deep as if retreating from the world they once sought to dominate. His voice, when it rose, no longer carried the weight of authority but the shrill edge of delirium. The fortress quaked with his raving. Servants spoke of nights when his screams pierced stone and mortar, as though the walls themselves groaned with his torment. On the final day, he commanded a feast, a last banquet that would outshine all others. Courtiers gathered in trembling obedience, unsure whether they had been summoned to witness his triumph or his collapse. The hall was dressed in gold and crimson, yet the air reeked of sickness. Torches flickered against damp walls, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to dance like mocking spirits. At the head of the long table sat the king, a corpse masquerading in royal robes, his crown slipping forward onto his hollow brow. As the dishes were laid before him, he waved them aside with a skeletal hand. Only the silver chalice mattered, gleaming like a relic in the firelight. He lifted it with trembling arms, whispering the same incantations that once silenced entire halls. But this time his voice cracked, his words dissolving into coughs. A thin line of blood streaked his lips as he pressed the chalice to his mouth, and when he drank, the court held its breath. For a moment, he seemed to rise again. His eyes flared, his back straightened, and a hollow laugh echoed through the chamber. "See," he rasped, "I cannot die. Their strength is mine. Eternity is mine." But before the echoes had faded, his body convulsed. The chalice fell from his grip, spilling its contents across the marble floor like some obscene libation. What followed was a death that defied dignity. His limbs jerked violently, striking the table, sending goblets crashing to the ground. Foam bubbled at his lips, mingled with blood, as his body writhed like a puppet whose strings were pulled by unseen hands. His courtiers shrieked, some fleeing, others rooted in terror. Servants crossed themselves, whispering prayers through trembling lips. The king's eyes bulged, staring not at the hall but at something beyond, as if 1,000 unseen souls had gathered to drag him down. His screams rang louder than any battle horn, a cacophony of pain and madness that filled the vaulted chamber. Witnesses swore that voices answered him, whispers rising from the spilled chalice, from the very stones of the fortress. "Join us," they hissed. "We are yours, and you are ours." The hall shook with the weight of it, chandeliers swaying, shadows stretching long as skeletal fingers. At last, his body collapsed. The convulsions stilled, leaving him sprawled across the banquet table, a crown fallen to the floor, his face frozen in a mask of horror. But even in death, his grip clung to the edge of the table, knuckles white, as though he still fought to hold on to the life slipping through his fingers. The silence that followed was unbearable, thick, suffocating, broken only by the drip of blood from his lips onto the cold stone. No priest dared approach, no courtier offered final rites. They left him there, abandoned in the hall that had once glorified his hunger, now reduced to a mausoleum lit by dying flames. In that grotesque moment, the legend was sealed. The king who sought eternity had found it, not in life, but in the eternal memory of a death so hideous that no age could forget it. When dawn finally broke over the fortress, its light revealed a palace transformed. The great banquet hall was deserted, the torches extinguished, the air heavy with the stench of spilt wine, blood, and smoke. On the table still lay the king's body, stiff and grotesque, his crown toppled at his side, as if eternity itself had cast him aside. No priest dared anoint him, no soldier claimed his remains. He was left to rot where he had feasted, surrounded not by mourners, but by silence so deep it pressed against the walls like a shroud. Word of his death spread like wildfire, carried by trembling tongues. Some said he had been consumed from within by the very souls he devoured, each voice rising in rebellion until his body could no longer hold them. Others swore the gods themselves had struck him down, offended by his mockery of creation. Whatever the truth, his end became more than a tale of sickness, it became a curse. The fortress never regained its glory. Servants fled in terror, leaving corridors unlit and chambers echoing with emptiness. Travelers who passed its shadowed walls spoke of hearing screams in the wind, as if the king still raged against the chains of death. Some swore that on moonless nights, a pale hand could be seen pressed against the highest tower window, clawing to escape. The castle became known as the Citadel of Echoes, a place where the living did not linger, and where the dead refused to rest. Generations later, the story endured, woven into legend and whispered to children as a warning. It was said that those who sought to conquer death would find themselves conquered by it instead. Scholars, centuries on, pointed to his illness as proof of folly, an early shadow of diseases born from consuming the very tissue that housed human thought. Priests preached of hubris, declaring that the soul was not a feast but a sacred fire, untouchable by mortal hunger. Yet even stripped of his crown, even cast down into disgrace, the king achieved what he desired in a way more terrible than he imagined. He became eternal, not in flesh nor in spirit, but in story. His name, once uttered in power, now lingered in dread. His legend became a warning carved not in stone, but in fear, that to chase eternity with blood and bone is to bind oneself to a death that never ends. And so the tale remains, a throne empty, a chalice overturned, and a king remembered not for his reign, but for the grotesque path he chose in pursuit of forever. In the echoes of his halls, in the whisper of the wind across broken battlements, his hunger still lingers. A reminder, carved deep into the marrow of history, that eternity is not a gift to be stolen, but a curse to be feared.